I had been with Northbridge Consulting for nearly 8 years, an eternity in our industry where turnover was as common as coffee breaks. My name is Clara Whitmore, and I was proud of what I had built, a reputation for reliability, insight, and calm under pressure. Clients trusted me. Junior associates came to me for advice. I wasn't flashy or political, just steady, just dependable. When Evelyn Cooper joined the firm as an intern, I wasn't given a choice. Gerald McCann, my supervisor, a man with a polished smile and a handshake that squeezed too hard, had simply assigned her to me. "She's promising," he said with a wink that made my skin crawl. "Make sure she shines." Evelyn was young, maybe 23, 24, with the breathless eagerness of someone desperate to prove themselves. She was intelligent. I could see that immediately. But she lacked judgment. She rushed through tasks, skipped over details. Still, I took her under my wing. I remembered what it was like to be young and terrified. The first months were challenging. I spent long evenings rechecking her numbers, rewriting her emails, smoothing over her blunders before they reached clients. She didn't thank me, not once, but I didn't need thanks. I just needed her to grow into the role and for Gerald to see that I could build a team, not just do good work. But something shifted after the third month. Evelyn stopped asking questions. She became cockier, more dismissive. She started forwarding client requests directly to Gerald without telling me, inserting herself into projects I had nurtured for years. Once I found her whispering with him by the coffee machine, laughing too loudly at something he said. When they spotted me, both went stiff, and Gerald patted her shoulder like a proud uncle. Should have trusted my instincts then, but I didn't. I told myself I was imagining it, that it didn't matter if she was networking. I stayed late every night to pick up her slack, believing hard work would protect me. The mistake happened 6 months in. It was an ordinary Wednesday morning when Gerald summoned me to his glass-walled office. He didn't even ask me to sit down. His mouth was tight, his fingers drumming impatiently on his desk. "There was a major error in the Ridgemont report," he said coldly. "A miscalculation in the projections. The client is furious. This could cost us the account." My stomach dropped. I knew that report. I had checked it personally. I had checked it twice. "But Gerald," I began carefully, "I reviewed everything." He cut me off with a slicing gesture. "The numbers were wrong. Clara, you're responsible." Behind him, through the clear glass, I saw Evelyn peeking from her desk, pretending to type. By Friday afternoon, I was packing up my desk. No chance to explain, no exit interview, just a tour letter from HR and a list of passwords to reset. As I placed the last of my things into a cardboard box, Evelyn floated by, a sympathetic look plastered onto her pretty face. "I'm so sorry," she murmured. "I know how much this place meant to you." Her voice was syrupy sweet, but her eyes were glittering with something else. I smiled thinly. I didn't say anything, not yet. But in that moment, standing there with my whole career crumbling around me, I made a silent vow. I would make them both regret this. The first few weeks after losing my job were a blur of anger, humiliation, and fear. I had lived modestly, but Northbridge had been my anchor, my health insurance, my mortgage payments, my sense of purpose. Now I spent my morning staring at the blinking cursor of my resume file, wondering how I could explain my sudden departure without sounding defensive or bitter. Word traveled fast in our industry. I sent out applications and heard nothing. Friends I had once lunched with every Friday grew strangely distant. I could imagine the whispered conversations. She was good, but maybe she lost her edge. Maybe she couldn't handle the pressure anymore. There were bills to pay. I canceled my gym membership, stopped buying groceries that weren't absolutely necessary. I watched the number in my savings account tick downward like sand through an hourglass. I thought about taking a cashier job at the local bookstore just to keep the lights on, but something inside me hardened against it. No, I hadn't worked this hard, built this much, to have it stolen from me without a fight. One evening, after another rejection email, I found myself scrolling through Northbridge's website. Evelyn's bio was right there, newly promoted to junior associate. Her photo was the same smile I remembered, but her description had changed. An emerging leader known for her strategic insight and client management skills. A laugh, sharp and ugly, escaped my throat. Strategic insight. She could barely write a professional email without spelling errors. And then I saw it. Northbridge had posted a public announcement celebrating Evelyn's key role in managing the Ridgemont account. My account, the very project that had supposedly been damaged by the error that cost me my job. It didn't make sense unless the error had been minor, something that could be fixed after they fired me, something they planned to fix. Maybe Gerald needed me gone to make room for Evelyn, or maybe it was even uglier than that. I dug deeper. A friend, one of the few who hadn't turned her back, agreed to meet for coffee. Monica Dell had left Northbridge 6 months earlier, but she still heard things. She hesitated before speaking, glancing around the cafe as if we were plotting treason. "I don't have proof," Monica said quietly, stirring her coffee. "But people talk. Gerald's been involved with Evelyn. Not officially. Nothing they could get sued over. But he's been pushing her career hard, too hard. It made some of the partners uncomfortable." I leaned back, my heart pounding. He needed to make room for her. Monica continued, "You were in the way. That's all it was." That night I lay awake for hours staring at the ceiling. I thought about every time Gerald had brushed off my suggestions, every time he had praised Evelyn for work I had corrected. I thought about Evelyn's crocodile tear sympathy as I packed up my desk. They had used me like a stepping stone and then kicked me aside. Good. Let them think I was broken. Let them think I would just disappear. Because if Gerald's reputation was built on lies, if Evelyn's ascent was built on fraud, then all I needed was one crack in their shiny facade, and I would find it. I started to plan. Not rash, not angry, patient, quiet. First, I needed a job. Not just any job, a job where I could see them, watch them, learn their weaknesses, and I knew exactly where to start. Finding a position in consulting when your name had a black mark next to it wasn't easy. Northbridge's shadow loomed over my resume like a warning sign. I knew I needed to be strategic. I wasn't going to aim for the large firms where my history would catch up to me immediately. I needed to go small, boutique agencies, mid-sized players still building their reputations, somewhere with clients that Northbridge also coveted. After 3 weeks of carefully targeted applications, I found it. Whitmore and Harlan Consulting, no relation to me despite the name. They were growing, aggressive, and most importantly, had just signed a minor contract with Ridgemont's competitor, Falcon Industries. The interview was almost laughably easy compared to the hoops Northbridge used to make candidates jump through. They needed someone with my experience. I was careful to frame my departure from Northbridge as a philosophical disagreement about client management styles. No bitterness, no mudslinging, just a polite, mature professional moving on. Within a week, I was sitting at a new desk in a modest office with slightly stained carpeting and a rattling air conditioner. But it didn't matter. I was back in the game. And the best part, Whitmore and Harlan had recently been sniffing around one of Northbridge's biggest clients, Caraway Technologies, a whale Gerald had been courting for years. If I played this right, I could steal more than just their dignity. I could steal their future. At first, I kept my head down. I took small projects. I built trust. I needed to make myself indispensable not just to Whitmore and Har, but to the clients that mattered. I reactivated old contacts under the guise of casual catch-ups, careful not to hint at my deeper intentions. Meanwhile, I watched Northbridge from a distance, their press releases, their social media posts, even the industry gossip at networking events. It didn't take long to spot the cracks. There were whispers that Ridgemont wasn't as satisfied with Northbridge as they pretended to be, that deliverables were late, that communications were sloppy. One evening, nursing a cup of black coffee at a networking mixer, I overheard 2 junior analysts from another firm snickering about Evelyn. "She thinks she's untouchable just because she's cozy with McCann," one said, loud enough for me to catch. "But she can't even keep her timeline straight. It's embarrassing." The other one chuckled. "He's going to regret betting on her." I smiled into my coffee. It was starting. Still, I had to be careful. A frontal assault would only backfire. Gerald and Evelyn were still insulated by titles, by connections. I needed proof, real, undeniable proof that would make them collapse under their own weight. Late one night, after another exhausting day of laying groundwork at Whitmore and Harlan, I sat at my tiny kitchen table, sketching out a plan. Step 1, get closer to Caraway Technologies. If I could win their trust, I could position Whitmore and Harlan as a viable alternative to Northbridge. Step 2, quietly document every misstep Evelyn made that leaked into the public or client arenas. Sloppy emails, missed deadlines, half-truths, anything I could eventually link back to her and Gerald. Step 3, expose the favoritism without looking like the bitter ex-employee. Let the evidence speak for itself. Let it look organic. Patience would be my weapon, precision my shield. I wasn't out for revenge anymore. I was out for justice, and I could already hear the distant creak of the empire they had built, ready to fall. Momentum was finally shifting. Whitmore and Harlan's leadership, particularly Martin Harland, the more approachable of the two founding partners, began involving me in key meetings. I handled them with quiet confidence, offering sharp insights without ever overstepping. Within 2 months, I was promoted to Client Relations Manager, a title that gave me access to conversations and contacts I hadn't dared dream of so soon. Caraway Technologies, that glittering prize Gerald had always lusted after, was at the top of Martin's list. They were unhappy. The whispers Monica had shared were becoming louder. Late projects, inflated invoices, excuses, and missed calls. Gerald's arrogance had finally begun to rot from within. I didn't push too hard. Instead, I arranged a casual lunch with Evelyn Brooks, Caraway's Director of Operations, under the pretext of discussing industry best practices. I listened more than I spoke, nodding sympathetically as she vented about how the consulting firms these days were all politics and no delivery. Not once did I mention Northbridge. I didn't have to. Elena did it for me. We trusted Gerald's team with critical deliverables, she said over her half-eaten salad. But half the time it feels like we're being managed by children. It's exhausting children. I smiled politely into my water glass. Later that night, I documented every detail of the conversation. Names, complaints, examples, no speculation, just facts. I kept a private file on a password-protected drive separate from my work accounts. This wasn't evidence yet, but it would be. Meanwhile, Evelyn's social media presence continued to provide me with ammunition. She couldn't resist posting photos from luxury dinners, business meetings that looked suspiciously like dates, and humble bragging about leading strategic initiatives at Northbridge. One post in particular caught my eye. A smiling photo of Evelyn clinking glasses with Gerald at an industry gala. The caption read, "Nothing beats great leadership and great company. A small scandal waiting to happen. I wasn't the only one noticing. During a team meeting at Whitmore in Harland, Tessa Monroe, a senior consultant, rolled her eyes as she scrolled her phone under the table. "She's unbelievable," Tessa muttered. "It's like she doesn't realize people can see through it." I didn't ask who she was talking about. I already knew. At the same time, the relationship between Gerald and Evelyn, once so carefully concealed, began to show signs of strain. A former Northbridge colleague, Aaron Leeds, mentioned offhand at a networking event that Gerald had started snapping at Evelyn in meetings, criticizing her lack of preparation, her careless mistakes. "She's skating on thin ice, and she doesn't even know it," Aaron said, swirling his drink. "Gerald's reputation can only take so many hits. Good. Let them devour each other. But patience was key. If I moved too soon, it would look like sour grapes. If I move too late, they might cover their tracks. I needed something undeniable. Not just gossip, not just public posts. I needed a mistake so big, so traceable that no amount of spin could protect them. And fate, as it happened, was about to deliver exactly what I needed. Opportunity rarely announces itself. It slips quietly into the room, disguised as a chance encounter, a throwaway comment, or in this case, a forwarded email. I was digital files late one evening when an unexpected message arrived in my inbox. It was from an old acquaintance, Victor Chen, a project manager at Caraway, someone I had helped years ago navigate a tricky vendor negotiation. The subject line simply read, "Thought you might find this interesting." Attached was a copy of an internal email chain between Caraway executives and Northbridge consultants, including Evelyn. It was a disaster. The email showed Evelyn had missed a critical regulatory compliance deadline. Worse, she had tried to cover it up by backdating a document submission. The client, of course, caught the discrepancy almost immediately when auditors requested time-stamped records. Reading through the exchange, my stomach twisted, not in fear, but in something darker, satisfaction. Evelyn's response was defensive, almost childish. Gerald's reply was worse. Instead of apologizing or addressing the issue, he blamed Caraway's internal teams for poor communication and implied that any regulatory trouble would be on their heads. I nearly laughed. It was breathtakingly stupid. This wasn't a small client misunderstanding. Regulatory violations meant real financial penalties, lawsuits, public exposure. Victor's brief note under the email said it all. "Northbridge isn't long for this account. Heads are going to roll. Thought you'd appreciate the heads up." I didn't respond. I simply saved the email on an encrypted drive alongside every other piece of evidence I had been quietly gathering. The trap was almost ready. In the following weeks, I stayed silent, working even harder to build Whitmore and Harlan's case to Caraway. We proposed a full audit of their current consulting contracts, positioning ourselves not as vultures, but as problem solvers, experts in crisis management. At the same time, Evelyn's confidence began to fracture. She still posted smug photos and vague inspirational quotes online, but her public appearances grew strained. Her smiles didn't reach her eyes. One night at a gala for local tech firms, I watched from across the room as Gerald snapped something at her, his face tight with barely suppressed fury. Evelyn flinched visibly before pasting on her brittle smile. People noticed. Whispers floated through the crowd. "They're on thin ice," Tessa muttered beside me, sipping her wine. "I almost feel bad for her." I didn't, not even a little. Meanwhile, my own reputation quietly soared. Whitmore and Harlan's leadership praised my steady hand and crisis intuition. Caraway began requesting me by name for consultations. It was happening slowly, carefully, but happening. Still, I knew better than to rush. The final blow had to be public, undeniable, and most importantly, completely outside of my fingerprints. The setup was nearly perfect. All I needed was the right moment to make sure Gerald and Evelyn's failures exploded in the place they feared most, the eyes of their clients. And that moment was coming sooner than they could possibly imagine. Caraway Technologies' executive team finally requested the meeting. Whitmore and Heron had been angling towards a confidential consultation about transitioning their business away from Northbridge. It was a Friday afternoon when the request came through. Martin Harlan called me into his office, a rare gesture that immediately told me how serious this was. "They want you leading the transition plan," Martin said, tapping a manila folder against the desk. "Full discretion, full support," I nodded, keeping my expression composed. But inside, a single thought echoed. It's time. The upcoming quarterly vendor accountability review would be the perfect battlefield. Caraway required all vendors to report on project statuses, billing transparency, and regulatory compliance quarterly. Gerald and Evelyn would be expected to present, and this time they would be walking into a trap of their own making. I worked late into the nights preparing, not sabotage. I wasn't foolish enough to falsify anything. I simply gathered the facts. Evelyn's missed deadlines, Gerald's evasive emails, the documented regulatory failure, neatly organized, professionally formatted, all cross-referenced against the expectations set in Northbridge's contracts with Caraway. I prepared my firm's findings separately, ready to be presented after Northbridge's review, so the contrast would be devastatingly obvious. The day of the review arrived with a biting chill in the air. I dressed conservatively, blending in among the executives gathering in Caraway's glass-walled conference room. Gerald and Evelyn arrived together, but there was a strange stiffness between them. Gerald's presentation began well enough. Bland assurances, inflated metrics, careful omissions. But Caraway's team, armed with internal audits and Victor's forwarded email chain, wasn't interested in being pacified. Halfway through, Elelenina Brooks cut him off sharply. "Mr. McCann, can you explain the discrepancy between your stated delivery timelines and the regulatory audit findings from 2 months ago?" Gerald's face flushed an unhealthy red. Evelyn shifted uncomfortably beside him, clutching her notes as if they might protect her. While there was some confusion, the client-side communication wasn't always clear. Gerald began. Elena didn't blink. "Are you suggesting that Caraway failed in its own internal processes?" Silence. A silence so heavy it vibrated against the glass walls. I watched, impassive, as Evelyn's mask of poise crumbled. She stammered out half-hearted excuses about misaligned expectations and last-minute changes. It only made things worse. When North Barbridge's time was up, the room's tension was so thick it was almost visible. Then Martin calmly gestured to me. "If we may, Whitmore and Harlan has prepared an independent review of vendor performance benchmarks for your consideration." What followed wasn't theatrical. It wasn't vindictive. It was devastating in its precision. I laid out charts, timelines, compliance failure points, all backed by Caraway's own records and independent audits. I made no personal attacks. I didn't even glance in Gerald or Evelyn's direction. I simply presented facts they could not refute. By the end, it wasn't even a contest. Caraway's executives thanked us politely, ushered Gerald and Evelyn out with brittle smiles, and invited Martin and me to stay behind for a further discussion. 2 hours later, Whitmore and Heron had a tentative agreement to take over Northbridge's account management for Caraway. As I left the building, I caught a glimpse of Gerald and Evelyn standing near the parking lot, locked in a fierce, whispered argument. Gerald's face was twisted in fury. Evelyn's was crumpled in something close to panic. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply walked to my car, started the engine, and pulled away. There was still work to do, but for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to exhale. Justice wasn't loud. Justice wasn't dramatic. Justice was silent, thorough, and absolute. The Monday after the review, word spread through the industry like wildfire. It didn't happen with press releases or dramatic announcements. It was more insidious. Quiet calls between executives, cautious whispers over lunch meetings, careful observations logged into vendor notes. By Wednesday, Caraway Technologies had formally issued a termination notice to Northbridge Consulting. They didn't mention the disastrous review in the letter, but they didn't need to. Everyone inside the industry knew. At Whitmore and Harland, the atmosphere buzzed with cautious excitement. Caraway was a heavyweight client. Securing their business meant a permanent seat at the table for my firm and for me. I kept my demeanor professional, refusing to celebrate publicly. Martin noticed, of course, giving me a small approving nod after the transition meeting. He understood this wasn't just a business victory for me. It was something far more personal. Meanwhile, Gerald was spiraling. Through back channels, Monica's friend in Northbridge's accounting department mostly, I heard the fallout was brutal. Gerald's superiors at Northbridge demanded explanations for the sudden loss of one of their longest-held accounts. He tried blaming external factors, regulatory changes, unreasonable client demands, even hinting that Whitmore and Harland had undermined them. None of it stuck. The internal audits had already started. Every delayed project, every compliance miss, every overbilling incident Evelyn had quietly covered up on his orders was now being dragged into the light. And Evelyn was beginning to crack. It started small. A missed meeting here, a curt email there. But by the end of the week, I heard she'd requested a closed-door meeting with Northbridge's HR department. I could only imagine the conversation. Blame was a heavy thing to carry alone, and Evelyn had never been strong under pressure. One evening, sitting at my modest kitchen table with a cup of tea, I allowed myself a moment to consider it. Would Evelyn turn on Gerald to save herself? It wouldn't surprise me. Their relationship had never been about loyalty. It had been about convenience. Gerald saw in Evelyn someone he could manipulate. Evelyn saw in Gerald a ladder she could climb. But now that ladder was collapsing. By the following week, a quiet rumor reached me. Evelyn had filed a formal complaint against Gerald, citing unethical leadership practices and pressure to falsify reports. It was subtle at first, just a mention at a networking breakfast, but by Friday it was practically an open secret among the consulting crowd. Northbridge was bleeding from within. I didn't have to lift a finger. Still, I stayed focused. Caraway's transition had to be flawless. Any sign of incompetence or vengefulness on my part could sabotage everything. I worked late, checking every line of the transition plan. I coached the junior consultants on handling Caraway's unique corporate culture. I even reached out to Elena personally to thank her for her trust. Professionalism first, always. The industry was watching now. Gerald, I knew, was scrambling behind. Closed doors, trying to rally what little support he had left. Evelyn, meanwhile, was nowhere to be seen. Her sudden sick leave, a transparent attempt to distance herself from the disaster. It wasn't enough. In a meeting with Martin and the executive team, I laid out a proposal, expand our marketing push subtly, offering corrective consulting services for firms damaged by vendor mismanagement. The executives loved it. It was the final twist of the knife. Not only were we taking Northbridge's most important account, we were positioning ourselves to sweep up any other clients disillusioned by their failures. As I left the conference room, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. I didn't see a vengeful woman. I saw a professional who had survived betrayal and risen above it. Gerald and Evelyn had underestimated me. They had seen only what they wanted to see. Woman past her prime, easy to discard. They had forgotten. People like me don't vanish. We endure. And when the time is right, we rebuild. It was late October when Gerald's name first appeared in the industry newsletters. At first, the articles were cautious, hedged with phrases like leadership transitions and organizational restructuring. But buried within the polite phrasing, the truth was clear. Northbridge was preparing to sever ties with him. The tone in the emails from Monica grew sharper. She described emergency board meetings, consultants hired to conduct independent reviews, panicked client calls asking for reassurance, and then the worst blow came. The Kessler Group publicly announced their intention to reevaluate their engagement with Northridge. Kessler was even bigger than Caraway. Without Caraway and Kessler, Northridge would lose almost 30% of their annual revenue. No amount of spin could hide that kind of collapse. Meanwhile, Evelyn's betrayal unfolded with breathtaking speed. Once her HR complaint had been filed, she started selectively leaking concerns to trusted connections in the industry, inappropriate demands from supervisors, a toxic work environment, unethical expectations placed on junior staff. She never named Gerald directly. She didn't have to. Everyone knew. Within a month, Gerald was suspended pending investigation. His access revoked overnight, no farewell party, no graceful exit. One day he was on the executive floor. The next his name was wiped from the company directory. I didn't celebrate, not outwardly. It wasn't over yet, because Evelyn, in her desperation to survive, had overplayed her hand. It turned out some of the documents she submitted to HR. Carefully edited emails, selectively chosen. Reports were traced back to her direct actions. Small inconsistencies started emerging. Memos she claimed were directives from Gerald turned out to be drafts she had modified. Emails she presented as evidence had conflicting timestamps. Northbridge's legal department noticed, and unlike Gerald, Evelyn didn't have decades of loyalty or board connections to protect her. I first heard about it at a networking lunch when an old colleague from vendor management leaned in and murmured, "You hear about Evelyn? Might be criminal charges if this keeps up." I kept my face neutral, my fork poised over a modest plate of salad. Inside, I felt the quiet click of inevitability. I had known Evelyn's ambition would be her undoing. She didn't have the discipline to lie cleanly, the patience to leave a trail others couldn't follow. A week later, news leaked that Evelyn had been placed on administrative leave. She had lawyered up immediately, but the stain was public now. Recruiters quietly blacklisted her. Colleagues stopped returning her calls. Even if she avoided legal consequences, her career was finished. At Whitmore in Harlem, I stayed focused. I drafted a white paper for an industry conference emphasizing ethical project management practices. I volunteered to mentor junior consultants. I met with Caraway's transition team twice a week, ensuring flawless execution. Professionalism always. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Martin stopped by my office. He glanced around to make sure we were alone, and then said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, "We couldn't have timed this better if we tried." I only smiled faintly in return. It wasn't timing, it was patience. By December, Gerald's name had been quietly blacklisted from every major consulting firm in the region. Northridge announced massive layoffs and an organizational rebranding effort. Internally, they were bleeding talent. Everyone with options was fleeing before the ship sank completely. As for Evelyn, she resurfaced briefly with a vague LinkedIn post about exciting new opportunities and taking time to focus on personal growth. It garnered a handful of pitying likes, but everyone who mattered knew. The industry has a long memory when it comes to betrayal and incompetence. By Christmas, Whitmore and Harland had doubled its client portfolio. Caraway publicly praised the transition as seamless and professional, a subtle but pointed jab at their former vendor. I spent Christmas Eve at home alone, sipping wine in the soft glow of my modest apartment's tree lights. No celebrations, no gloating, just peace. And for the first time in a long while, a sense that the future was mine to shape. January brought a quiet, almost anticlimactic sense of finality. There were no explosive headlines or dramatic confrontations. Gerald McCann's career simply ended. His LinkedIn profile shifted from executive vice president to consultant, open to opportunities. No one publicly acknowledged his departure. He became another ghost in an industry that moves on quickly when failure smells too strong. Evelyn Cooper's collapse was slower, more humiliating. Despite her attempts to pivot, rebranding herself as an independent strategist, she found no takers. Her name had become a cautionary tale whispered among hiring committees, a risk not worth taking. The last Monica heard, Evelyn was considering a complete career change, possibly outside consulting altogether, teaching certifications, maybe something where her past wouldn't follow her so easily. Meanwhile, I stayed the course. Caraway signed a multi-year agreement with Whitmore and Heron. Their leadership team often mentioned the refreshing professionalism of our collaboration during networking events, an obvious, if polite, dig at their previous vendor. Other companies noticed invitations to submit proposals arrived in my inbox almost weekly. Firms that had once barely returned my calls now asked if I could spare a lunch, a coffee, a quick conversation. The momentum was real, but I treated it with the same caution that had brought me this far. No gloating, no recklessness, only steady hands and clean work. One afternoon in late January, I sat across from Martin, my supervisor at Whitmore and Harland, reviewing the quarterly expansion plan. "You've built something solid here, Clara," he said. "It's rare to see someone recover after what Northbridge did to you. Rarer still, to do it without burning bridges." I allowed myself a small, real smile. "Thank you. I plan to keep it that way." He nodded approvingly. "Leadership is watching, just so you know." That night, walking home through the crisp winter air, I realized something quietly extraordinary. For the first time in years, I wasn't looking over my shoulder. No Gerald waiting to undermine me. No Evelyn smiling knives into my back. Just open road ahead. Still, I hadn't forgotten what I'd learned. Ambition without ethics corrodes from the inside out. Quick victories without substance rot foundations. Connections without loyalty crumble under pressure. I would not repeat their mistakes. Instead, I started laying the groundwork for something better. Mentoring programs inside Whitmore and Harper audits, systems that protected good work and punished mediocrity. I wasn't just surviving the system anymore. I was beginning carefully to reshape it. Weeks later, at a mid-sized conference in Chicago, I crossed paths with Elena Brooks from Caraway. "Over coffee," she said casually. "You know, a few people assumed you'd come after them harder. Lawsuits, scandals, all that. Honestly, I respect how you handled it." I sipped my coffee, considering I didn't want a spectacle, I said. I just wanted the truth to matter again. And it had. Maybe not as loudly or as dramatically as a courtroom brawl. But the right people knew. The industry remembered. And the people who had tried to break me were the ones who ended up broken. Without a single shouted word, without a single burned bridge, only the quiet, relentless pull of gravity, a patient, inevitable fall. I had simply stepped aside and let it happen. And now, at last, I could build something better from the ashes they left behind. Spring came quietly, almost without me noticing. The city unfurled itself again. Green leaves pushing through cracks, cafes setting tables outside, long evenings heavy with warm air and possibility. At Whitmore and Harland, my role continued to evolve. I wasn't just managing accounts anymore. I was helping shape policy, mentorship programs, transparent evaluations. Leadership training focused not on who could impress in a meeting, but on who delivered when it counted. It felt small some days, these changes. Slow, but real. The industry still buzzed occasionally about what had happened at Northbridge, but it was background noise now. Gerald's name rarely surfaced. When it did, it was usually followed by a shake of the head and a muttered, "What a shame." Evelyn, last I heard, was working for a small marketing firm in a different state, far from the clients and prestige she once chased. I didn't feel triumph when I thought of them. I didn't feel much at all, really. They were chapters already written, ones I had read, understood, and left behind. One afternoon, sitting in the sun outside a cafe, Monica joined me for coffee. She still worked in the industry, but had left Northbridge months ago, sensing the slow rot that had begun to spread. "You ever think about it?" she asked after a pause in our conversation. "How it all shook out?" I thought for a moment, stirring my drink. "I think about what it taught me," I said finally. "About patience, about trust, about how easy it is to believe people who are good at appearances, and how hard it is to build something real." Monica nodded slowly. "And what now?" she asked. "You're not just surviving anymore?" I smiled, the kind of smile that felt new, unfraught. "I'm building something better," I said. "Not just for me, for anyone who deserves a fair shot." In the months that followed, that vision became clearer. I helped launch an internal initiative at Whitmore and Harlem, a project aimed at supporting mid-career professionals, especially those who'd been marginalized or overlooked. We paired mentorship with leadership opportunities, not token gestures. Real investment, real trust. It wasn't flashy, it wouldn't make headlines, but it mattered. And slowly the culture around me began to shift, not because of loud demands, but because people could see in our work and our results that integrity wasn't a weakness. It was a strength. One evening, as I locked up my office and stepped into the soft dusk, I allowed myself a rare, full moment of peace. I had survived. I had rebuilt. And more than that, I had won, not by destroying others, but by refusing to become like them. There would always be Geralds and Evelyn in the world, people who thought shortcuts in politics were the only way forward, people who confused cruelty with strength. But there would also be people like me, people who remembered that work could be more than survival. That dignity was not naive. That patience and principle were not weaknesses to hide, but foundations to stand on. The road ahead was open, and this time I wasn't walking it with fear or anger in my chest. Only clarity, only hope, only the steady, unshakable knowledge that whatever came next, I was